Hello, my dear friends. A pregnant nun, a priest who hides a love poem in the Bible, a chastity belt locked by a jealous husband. These are not myths. They are real pieces of history, pulled from the shadows of medieval life. Behind the walls of monasteries and under the floors of churches, education speaks its own language, silent, coded, punished, but never lost. Tonight, we will follow those secrets back to the past, where love of law and shame guarded the holy vestments. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. Now we dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If you think monks and nuns in the Middle Ages lived free from desire, you're mistaken. Even behind stone walls, even after taking vows, they still wanted what they were told to deny. It did not go away just because they prayed more or spoke less. Some resisted, some gave in, most lived quietly in between. Monks woke before sunrise. They washed with cold water, dressed in the same thick wool robes, and walked through narrow halls without speaking. Meals were plain and eaten in silence. Prayers marked the hours. Nuns followed the same pattern. They kept their heads covered, their voices low, and their routines steady. But the silence did not mean peace. The body did not forget itself just because the mouth stayed closed. Desire showed itself in small ways. A glance held too long. A breath caught mid-prayer. A tremble in the fingers. One monk might look up from his book each time a certain nun passed by. She might never look back, but she walked slower when he was nearby. No one ever said anything, but everyone noticed. These moments happened quietly and often, most of the time. They passed without action, but not always. When people are told not to feel something, they do not stop feeling. They just stop speaking. Inside small, cold cells, monks and nuns tried to push away thoughts they were not allowed to have. Some fasted, some walked barefoot on stone, some wrote down prayers again and again until their hands cramped. But thoughts have their rhythm. They show up when the hallways are empty. They linger when the candles are low. Some found ways to meet. There were corners of the building that went unwatched, garden paths that curved out of sight, chores that gave people reasons to be in the same place at the same time. It did not take much. A shared task, a small signal, a pattern of silence repeated too often, a few minutes together after dark, then back to routine. These meetings were brief, but they carried weight. For some, it brought guilt. For others, a strange sense of comfort. Most tried to stop after the first time. Not all succeeded. And when something changed, it could not be hidden forever. If a nun became pregnant, the process was quiet. She was removed from the convent and sent to a different place. No announcement, no farewell, just a name missing the next morning. Another sister took her chores. The schedule stayed the same. The others understood what had happened, but no one mentioned it. The baby was usually taken away, sometimes to a village family, sometimes to another religious house, sometimes to a place no one has ever been to. This was not rare, it was not openly tracked, but it happened more often than the church admitted. The goal was not to punish, but to keep the system running. As long as the rules were followed in public, the rest could be dealt with privately. A clean surface was more important than honest records. Some monks and nuns kept their vows all their lives. They fought desire with discipline. They confessed their thoughts. They accepted the discomfort. They believed in the rules. But even they did not live without struggle. The thoughts still came. The effort never stopped. Manuals were written about temptation. Lists of sins. Instructions for how to respond. But books did not stop what happened in real life. People do not always act like the people in the rules. That was true in the 14th century. And it is still true now. Everyone in the monastery understood the risk, but they also understood the silence. It protected them. It gave them a second chance. or at least gave them time to disappear quietly. The robes were meant to hide the body, but the body was always present, under the fabric, under the rule, under the expectation of purity. People prayed harder, they ate less, they avoided eye contact. Still, the thoughts came. If the church had awarded medals for pretending nothing happened, monasteries would have had more gold than the crown. And yet the bells kept ringing, the candles kept burning, the rules stayed in place, the same words were spoken every day, and when one person left, another stepped in. The system moved forward. Now that we have seen how desire survived, even in places meant to crush it, we will step into a different kind of space, a space where the punishment does not hide behind doors. This time, it walks openly in the street. Sometimes just silence was not enough. When thoughts became too loud and glances too frequent, some monks and nuns took things a step further. They did not speak of it, but they found ways, and once one opening was found, others followed. The walls of a monastery were thick, but not solid all the way through. There were old storage paths, servants' hallways, passages once used by masons and left behind. Some tunnels connected the men's and women's quarters. They were built for practical reasons, not for privacy. But privacy is what they eventually offered. These were the spaces where monks and nuns passed quietly at night, not by chance, but by intention. Letters became part of the pattern, simple ones, sometimes just a line or two, written on worn scraps of paper, folded carefully and hidden in sleeves, slipped between the pages of prayer books, left on windowsills or under kitchen bowls. They never said much. They never used names, but they said enough. A time, a place. A brief phrase with a meaning only two people understood. Some meetings were only moments long. A whisper beside a stairwell, a touch at the edge of a candle's reach. Others were longer, planned, covered by shared duties or assigned work in the gardens or cellars. They moved fast and quietly, but not always without risk. A missing person, a door left ajar, a candle burning too late. These were small things, but in the silence of a monastery, small things stood out. When a nun became pregnant, things moved quickly. The order did not wait for rumours. She was removed, often before her condition became visible. A journey was arranged. She left quietly, sometimes at dawn, sometimes in the dark. The others were not told where she went. Sometimes they guessed. Sometimes they already knew, because it had happened before. The child was not kept. Some were sent to nearby farms, raised by families who were paid just enough not to ask questions. Others were left at the doors of smaller convents, labelled as foundlings. A few were taken into monasteries and given to women who could not have children of their own. They grew up with no stories of where they came from, only the clothes they were wrapped in. These departures were not announced. There were no final blessings, no ceremonies. One day, a nun was there. The next, she was not. A new sister arrived soon after. She took the same room, wore the same habit, and followed the same routine. The rhythm of the monastery continued without pause. That was the point. The structure mattered more than the people inside it. It was not rare. These were not strange or exceptional cases. They were part of the life that people lived behind those stone walls. Everyone had seen someone disappear. Everyone had watched someone return looking thinner, quieter, and more tired than before. But no one talked about it. The silence served its purpose. The church preferred it that way. Officially, vows were sacred. Mistakes were sins. But practically, moving someone to another convent caused less trouble than a formal trial. There were enough rules already. Adding shame to them did not make the walls any stronger. Even so, the effort to keep everything hidden took work. Those who passed letters had to avoid the eyes of senior clergy. Those who met in secret had to learn the patterns of others' movements. And sometimes, mistakes were made. A missing note. A hallway crossed too slowly. A sound behind the wrong door. But even with the risks, people continued. They did not do it for rebellion. They did it because they were human, and because silence, for all its weight, was not always enough. If monasteries had put as much energy into ventilation as they did into cover-ups, maybe fewer things would have happened in the shadows. Yet the walls remained. The prayers continued. The same voices chanted the same lines at the same hours. The same robes were folded. The same candles were lit. The difference was only visible in the missing faces, and no one asked why. Now that we have looked at what was hidden inside, it is time to look outside. There were times when mistakes could not be swept away, times when sin was not just noticed, but displayed, and not just displayed quietly, displayed in front of a crowd. Not all desire was acted out in secret meetings. Some of it lived inside visions, inside words, inside stories that people told with a certain tone and just enough distance to stay safe, especially for women, where direct confession brought danger. Many feelings had to come through dreams and divine experience. It was no less real. It was just better protected. In convents across Europe, some nuns claimed to have visions. Many were honest. Some were overwhelmed by fasting, illness, or isolation. But the words they used to describe what they saw were not always the same ones used by monks. Their visions came with warmth, with closeness, with touch, and sometimes with language that sounded more like longing than prayer. One of the most discussed examples came from a woman named Lardis. She lived in the 13th century. She had devoted her life to the church. She fasted often. She spoke little. She wrote about her visions, and those writings were copied and passed between other convents. In one of them, she described how Christ appeared to her in her cell. She said he kissed her mouth, not in a symbolic way, not with metaphor, but with tenderness and feeling. She said his hand rested on her chest. She felt filled with light. That music filled the room, though no instruments were present. She felt warmth flood her body. She wept, not from fear, but from joy. She said she wanted the moment never to end. Her confession was approved by the church, not because of its content, but because she explained it as holy, as part of a spiritual union, not physical, not sinful, just divine. Many other women wrote things like this. They chose their words carefully. Sometimes they said they were being pierced with light. Sometimes they said they were embraced by the presence. But when you read them slowly, the meaning is not hard to catch. These were descriptions of closeness, of feeling, of being seen, of being touched. And for many of them, it was the only safe way to say they wanted those things. Most people did not question their honesty. These were not women trying to shock anyone. They were trying to find language for feelings they could not say directly. In a world where a woman could not say she longed to be held, she could say she longed for union with God. In a time when women were punished for enjoying their bodies, they could say they trembled in spiritual ecstasy, and people listened. This kind of vision was easier to accept because it stayed within a religious frame. The more holy it sounded, the less it was questioned. As long as the experience ended in prayer and not in bed, it was tolerated, even admired. In some cases, the women were praised for their closeness to heaven. Their writings were copied. Their stories were used in sermons. Not always because people believed every word, but because they served a purpose. These visions gave women space, a space where they could describe what they felt without being called wicked, a space where their own emotions were taken seriously, even if only under the name of God. It was a narrow path, but it was there, and many used it. Some church officials were cautious. They asked for reviews. They questioned what the women saw, but most of the time, they approved the stories if they followed a pattern. Pain first, then closeness, then peace. If a vision ended with surrender and devotion, it was labelled pure. If it drifted into too much detail, too much pleasure, too much clarity, it was called suspicious. Still, Many slipped through. They knew how to write what needed to be read, and readers knew how to read what was really being said. It was a system, one built on shared silence, careful phrasing, and unspoken understanding. It is hard to know how many of these women believed every part of what they saw. Some truly felt visited. Others may have described dreams they barely understood. A few may have shaped their words to fit what was allowed, but the result was the same, a form of expression that could not exist anywhere else. If male theologians had spent less time arguing about angels and more time reading convent journals, they might have learned something useful, but they did not. The visions remained in the margins, copied in small script, shared between sisters, hidden behind blessings and Latin phrases. Next, we will step out of the cell and into the court, where desire was dressed in silk, written into poems, and handed over in the form of gloves and scarves. It looked more elegant, but it was just as heavy. Not everyone wrote about visions. Some people kept their feelings under more layers. Silk layers, social layers, literary layers. If you were a noble in medieval Europe, and you wanted to express affection without crossing the line, you turned to something called courtly love, a system built around restraint, distance, and carefully chosen gestures. It was less about passion, more about the idea of passion. Courtly love started in southern France, in the courts of the nobility. It was shaped by poets, musicians, and ladies of status. It was not about marriage. It usually took place outside marriage. But it was not supposed to be physical either, at least not openly. The whole point was longing, not fulfillment. You admired someone from afar. You served them. You wrote poems for them. And maybe, if you were lucky, they gave you a token in return. Those tokens became a kind of language. A glove meant interest. A scarf meant devotion. A lock of hair meant intimacy. These were small objects, easy to carry, easy to hide. A knight might tie a lady's favour to his lance. A lady might wear a ring in secret. They were signs, but also shields. You could explain them away if someone asked. A gift from a cousin. A gesture of thanks. Only the people involved knew the truth. This game of giving and guessing became part of noble culture. It was played at tournaments, at feasts, and during hunts. Everyone knew the rules. The love had to remain chaste, at least in theory. If it became too obvious, too bodily, it lost its charm. The power was in what was not said, in what was imagined. And that imagination had a structure. A knight was the servant. The lady was the ideal. He praised her beauty. He suffered in silence. She allowed just enough kindness to keep him loyal. The language around this was full of symbols. A closed garden, a flowing stream, a wounded heart. People talked about surrender, but not in military terms. They spoke of service, but not to a king. The metaphors were thick, sometimes confusing, but always intentional. The real meanings lived under the surface. You had to know how to read them. Literature from this period is full of it. A knight might write that he was allowed to rest under the rose, or that he found shelter in the orchard. These phrases were not about flowers or the weather. They were about sex, disguised, poetic, polite sex. It allowed writers to talk about private things without saying them out loud. A useful skill in a time when saying too much could get you whipped or worse. The funny part is, for something so indirect, it was also very public. These poems were performed. These stories were shared. People listened, blushed, and laughed, all while pretending they didn't fully understand. It was a kind of social theatre. Everyone had a role. No one admitted what was going on, but no one was fooled either. And while the upper class indulged in this coded affection, the church mostly looked the other way. As long as things stayed on paper and no scandals came to light, there was room to play. It was safer than touching. It was more acceptable than confessing. You could write 100 verses about your suffering heart, and as long as you added a line about purity, no one would bother you. Of course, reality was messier. Not every courtly love stayed pure, Some turned physical, some ended in heartbreak, a few ended in exile. But the system survived because it let people express desire in a way that felt noble. It was dressed up, slowed down, and turned into entertainment, like watching a play where the actors pretend not to touch, even though everyone knows what scene they're in. This was how feelings moved in castles and great halls, not in shouts or bold moves, but in hints and ribbons. A glove slipped into a sleeve, a poem left on a windowsill, a sigh that was just loud enough. People used what they could. Their tools were velvet, verse, and vague vocabulary. The emotions were real. The methods were just better tailored. You have to admire the effort. All that energy spent avoiding direct language. It's no wonder they needed jesters just to break the tension. Coming up next, we'll step out of the ballroom and into the sick room. Intimacy looked very different. Less poetry, more practical, and not always by choice. If the castles were filled with illusion, the villages were where the performance became routine. Not with musicians or actors, but with nods, silences, and carefully chosen words. Everyone knew how to play their part. The script wasn't written, but it didn't need to be. It passed from mother to daughter, from neighbour to neighbour, folded into everyday habits like kneading dough or brushing soot from the hearth. In these small communities, the truth was rarely spoken directly. People noticed things, but they didn't mention them, not out loud. Because breaking the silence meant breaking the balance, and balance was survival. It was how you kept peace with the landlord, with the priest, with your own family. It was how you kept a roof over your head even when the baby arrived a little too early, or looked too much like someone it shouldn't. Midwives moved through these layers like experts. They weren't just there for birth. They were the ones who saw what everyone else avoided. They caught the babies whose fathers were travelling merchants. They wiped brows in bedrooms where no husband had ever lived, and when asked who the father was, they'd shrug, maybe smile, maybe say something vague about fate. A good midwife never named names. She didn't have to. Everyone already knew. There was a certain joke that made the rounds, always with a lowered voice and a sideways glance. Half the village is fathered by the nobility. It went, but no one dares put it in the parish book. The joke always got a chuckle, sometimes a sigh, and more than once a nod that said, "Yes, that sounds about right," especially when the blonde child was born to the dark-haired baker's wife, or when the priest's servant girl suddenly had to visit her aunt for several months and returned thinner, quieter, and never married. The lines between respectable and not were always shifting. If a woman married before anyone noticed, she was just lucky. If she didn't, but had family to protect her, she might still keep her place. If she had neither, well, then the village might look away, or not. Much depended on how well liked she was, or who the father might have been. These arrangements didn't make it into sermons, but they made it into a routine. A nobleman might slip coins to the midwife and never speak of it again. A housekeeper might suddenly have a new shawl and no explanation. A mother might tell her daughter, "Don't ask questions, just be careful," and hope that would be enough. It often wasn't, but it helped people feel like they had control, even when they didn't. It would be easy to call it hypocrisy, a society that preached chastity and then quietly managed its exceptions. But that's not quite right. It was more like a kind of understanding, a soft rule book, written in glances and customs, not laws. People knew what was expected in public and what could be negotiated in private. You wore the right clothes to mass. You nodded to the priest. Then you went home and decided what parts of the sermon applied to your life. Even the clergy understood this. A priest might hear confessions all day and speak no names. He might counsel a woman to pray for strength, knowing full well she had no options. He might tell a man to provide for a child discreetly, and then close the book and say no more. Morality was a matter of balance, not purity. Too much honesty could cause more harm than the sin itself. That's why things stayed quiet. That's why the performance continued. Because pretending made life smoother. It lets people move forward. It allowed forgiveness without confrontation. It gave women a way to survive, and men a way to save face. It made room for mistakes, as long as no one admitted them. The result was a kind of peace, not a clean one, not an innocent one, but a peace that worked. People brought bread to the unwed mother without comment. They watched over the fatherless child without asking questions. They covered for each other, not out of deceit, but out of necessity. There's something oddly functional about it. In a world without safety nets, the performance was the safety net. Everyone played along because the alternative was exile, or worse. Pretending wasn't cowardice, it was wisdom. The kind of wisdom passed down not in books, but in gestures, in silences, in knowing when not to know. Next, we'll step out of the village and return to the cloisters, but this time, not for letters or visions. This time, it's the sound of footsteps at night, and the silence that followed in the morning. If silence helped people survive in the village, it served a different purpose behind monastery walls. There, silence was discipline, a practice, a kind of worship. But not every silence was holy. Some were just quiet because they had no place else to go. Books were everywhere in the cloister. Shelves of thick volumes bound in calfskin, pages lined with careful Latin. The air always smelled faintly of old ink and beeswax polish. But not every book held sermons. Not every page was written for God, tucked between psalms and theology. Sometimes you'd find something else. A folded paper, a bit of verse, a name scratched and then hastily crossed out. Small signs that even here, in the most disciplined corners of the world, feeling still found a way in. Some monks and nuns kept journals, not openly, not on the official records, but inside the bindings of devotionals, or hidden in the flaps of their robes. They wrote things, not always dramatic, sometimes just a sentence, a question, a memory that refused to fade. Some wrote prayers that looked like longing. Others wrote longing and hoped it would pass for prayer. There's one example still whispered about in academic corners. A monk who wrote daily reflections for decades, each one tucked into the back of his breviary. At first, they read like ordinary notes, a headache, a passage he struggled to memorize. But then came the dreams. He began recording visions of the Virgin Mary, at first gentle, maternal, but slowly they changed. He described her touch, her warmth, the scent of her breath. Not blasphemous, exactly, but not what one expected from a cloistered life. He stopped calling her mother. He started calling her beloved. Some scholars say this was spiritual ecstasy. Others suggest it was loneliness, shaped into something safer. But whatever it was, he kept writing it down, and he kept it hidden. Because even in a place dedicated to introspection, not all thoughts were welcome. Not all feelings had a place to breathe. Nuns, too, left traces. A scrap of parchment folded into a prayer book, stained with wax and time, holds verses written in a woman's hand. The Latin is clumsy, the rhythm is uneven, but the words are steady. She describes a presence beside her at night, not frightening, not divine, just warm, steady. She doesn't name him or her, but the longing is unmistakable, not just for touch, for being seen, for being known. These weren't confessions. They were records, marks left by people who had taken vows but still carried memories, still dreamed, still imagined futures they would never live, and instead of speaking them aloud, they wrote them down, folded them into the quiet spaces of their days, hiding them between verses and prayers. It might seem surprising. We imagine monasteries as places of purity, of distance from earthly things, and in many ways they were. But human thoughts do not vanish just because the door closes behind you. The body still remembers, the heart still stirs, and sometimes it needs a place to go. Writing became that place, not for rebellion, but for containment. It was safer to write about a dream than to speak of it. Safer to put a name on paper than to say it aloud. Once written, a feeling could be folded, hidden, or stored away, not erased, but managed, and in a world that prized control, that was everything. Of course, not every monk or nun kept such records. Many lived quietly, obediently, with little need to write beyond their assigned duties. But even then, they read. They copied texts filled with saints who wept, who yearned, who trembled at visions that blurred the line between divine and intimate. And as they copied, perhaps they understood. Perhaps they saw themselves not as failures, but as part of a longer story, one where even the most devout sometimes felt too much. Today, when these fragments resurface in archives or under layers of binding glue, they feel both fragile and bold. The ink has faded, the paper is brittle, but the feeling remains. You don't need to be a monk to recognize it. You just need to have loved someone you couldn't name, or missed someone you weren't supposed to. It's easy to romanticize the past, to imagine the cloister as quiet and clean, untouched by confusion, but that was never true. The silence was full of whispers, and the books were heavier than they looked, not just with doctrine, but with feeling, with memory, with things that never quite found their way out. Next, we'll open another book, not in a cloister, but in a castle, and inside, we won't find prayers or psalms. We'll find poetry, draped in symbols, gloved in metaphors, but still reaching for the same warmth. If the pages of hidden journals were quiet confessions, some nights inside the cloister were anything but silent, especially when the doors were locked, the candles lit low, and certain rules quietly moved to the side. One such night began like any other. The evening prayer ended. The cloister bell sounded its final tone. Silence was expected. Reflection, rest, and dim chambers. But behind a narrow wooden door near the dormitory stairs, something else stirred. The door opened not to a cell or chapel, but to a storeroom long unused. Inside, the space had changed. Benches were moved. A table was draped in linen, and from a small harp in the corner, a woman in a grey veil plucked soft notes as others arrived. The nuns wore masks, nothing elaborate, just scraps of cloth, bits of lace, a feather here, a thread of ribbon there. Their habits remained, but the usual stiffness had softened. One woman tied a red sash around her waist, another slipped off her shoes. A few held hands for a moment longer than was needed. There were no vows exchanged, no words, just glances and the soft creak of old floorboards. Someone poured wine from a hidden flask. Not much, just enough to tint the metal goblets. The wine was sharp, bitter at the edges, but it carried warmth, and they drank it without ceremony. It wasn't about excess, it was about presence, about letting the day end not in silence, but in music and movement. A few danced, slowly at first, a step, a sway, a gentle rhythm, no lessons, no rules, just motion in time with the harp and the breath in the room. Sleeves fluttered, sandaled feet shifted on bare wood. No one led, no one followed. It was not a performance, it was a release, a small rebellion, tucked into a night that should have been still. The music was light, but steady. No drums, just strings and humming, and the occasional soft clap that echoed longer than expected. Someone lit a small oil lamp and tucked it behind a jug, making shadows ripple along the stone walls. The air began to warm, not just from the bodies, but from the breaking of routine, from the way they allowed themselves, just for this hour, to move without permission. Word of the gathering eventually reached beyond the cloister. A kitchen boy saw something he shouldn't, or perhaps a visitor overheard laughter through a window crack too wide. The church responded. As it often did, a letter was sent. A bishop made inquiries. A stern-faced man arrived to speak with the abbess. But nothing came of it. Not really. The event was called a misunderstanding, a harmless celebration to honour a saint, a moment of seasonal joy, and the matter was dropped, not because the church believed it, but because one of the women in the room that night had a brother in the capital, a man who wore rings of gold and sat close to people with crowns. He sent a message of his own, polite, vague, just clear enough, and the investigation faded into dust. This wasn't rare. Cloisters were expected to be disciplined, but they weren't immune to power. Influence travelled quietly. It lived in family names and discreet letters. In times of scandal, a well-placed relative could do more than prayer ever could. That night's gathering became another story filed under private matters, best left alone. Of course, not every convent had such protection. In other places, similar gatherings brought harsh consequences, transfers, punishments, silence that lasted longer than it should. But here, in this particular place, the story ended with a shrug, a private talk, a slightly longer morning mass the next day. Nothing more. And so, it happened again. Not often, not carelessly, but enough times that the storeroom grew familiar. The harp strings were replaced when they broke, that the wine kept coming, just a little at a time, with the linens from the city. It was no longer shocking. Just understood. These weren't wild parties. They weren't acts of defiance. They were moments of humanness, of women with lives cut by routine who, for a few hours, reclaimed their bodies, their laughter, their right to rhythm. No oaths were broken. No sacred relics were disturbed. But something in the air changed. A kind of warmth. A kind of reminder. And honestly, in a place where every day felt the same, a little music did more good than harm. The church might not say it aloud, but even the saints, if they had to walk in those shoes, might have asked for a dance now and then. In the next part, we step further into this quiet theatre of appearances, where the world outside praised virtue, but inside, the performance often continued behind drawn curtains. The sun didn't shine any brighter for those who confessed. It only made things more visible. By midday, the square filled slowly, as it often did when punishment was on the day's schedule. People didn't need to be invited. Word passed through kitchens, through bread stalls, through the whispers of altar boys. Something about public shame had its own gravity, and no one liked to miss a performance. A woman in a coarse grey shift stood barefoot on the flat stones. In her hands, she carried a candle. Not just any candle, but one so tall that its base touched the ground when she held it upright. The wax had already begun to drip, forming slow rivulets round her fingers. She kept her eyes down. Her lips moved silently, probably repeating some prayer she'd been told to say. Maybe she didn't remember the words. It didn't matter. Everyone else was watching the flame. This wasn't her first walk, or the village's first spectacle. There had been so many that some people began to treat them like part of the Sunday rhythm, just something that happened after Mass, like stew or gossip. The faces in the crowd were always familiar, neighbours, elders, and children who didn't understand but knew it was important to stare. And a few men, arms crossed, acting like the whole thing was beneath them even as they leaned forward. The offences were rarely clear. Adultery, improper thoughts, a child born too soon, sometimes just being seen with the wrong man after dusk. No one asked too many questions. Once the priest announced the sentence, the details became unimportant. What mattered was that someone was being punished, and that made everyone else feel safer. For women, the punishments were harsher. That was the unspoken rule. Men could sin in secret, confess quietly behind wooden panels, and walk away with 3 Hail Marys. But women often paid with their bodies on display. If not their flesh, then at least their posture, their lowered heads, their trembling hands, and sometimes even that wasn't enough. There was a case once where a young wife had to crawl the perimeter of the chapel, holding a sign written in bad Latin. Most people couldn't read it. but they understood the meaning. It said she had dishonoured her vows. Her knees were bloodied by the end. No one offered help. That was the point. Even priests were not immune, or so people were told. There were rumours, of course. Stories whispered late at night that a priest had taken confession from a young boy, only to unburden himself in return. Quiet sins exchanged like coins. But those stories never made it to the public square. Not with candles, not with signs. Those were handled differently, silently, protected by layers of rank and cloth. The church had a strange relationship with punishment. On one hand, it preached mercy. On the other, it built entire rituals around shame. A person could be forgiven in theory, but only after they had been broken publicly. There was a belief that suffering cleansed the soul, that humiliation purified the heart. It seemed more like a theatre. Children watched these displays with wide eyes. Some cried, some laughed. A few copied the movements at home, pretending to carry candles or repeat the priest's hand gestures. It became part of their world, a rhythm passed down like recipes or hymns. And yet, some found comfort in the ritual. They knew the steps. They could predict the silence before the announcement, the collective intake of breath, the first tear, the rustle of skirts as someone collapsed under the pressure. It was predictable. And for people living in uncertain times, predictability had its kind of holiness. Not everyone agreed. There were quiet protests, women who muttered under their breath, men who looked away, pretending to be interested in their boots. Even children who asked why only certain people had to walk barefoot with candles. But those voices were soft, and the system, heavy as the church doors, didn't move easily. It's hard to say if anyone ever learned a lesson from it, or if shame made anyone better. What it did, though, was remind everyone who held the power, who got to decide what counted as sin, who got to watch, and who had to walk. And honestly, if you looked close enough, some in the crowd seemed to enjoy it a bit too much, their eyes sharp, their mouths curved, as if sin was only bad when it wasn't theirs. Next, we'll slip out of the village square and back behind monastery walls, where sin didn't stop. It only changed form. They said confession would cleanse the soul, but for women, it often came with a side of humiliation. A man could whisper his wrongdoings and walk away with a few prayers. A woman, especially one suspected of desire, would leave her dignity behind on the church floor. It started with the candle. She was made to hold it in both hands, arms outstretched. Even if it burned, it looked like penance, but it felt like punishment. The wax dripped fast in the summer heat, landing on her knuckles and wrists. Her hands shook, but she held on. Around her, the crowd watched without saying much. There was always a crowd. Her dress had been dyed a faded yellow, the colour chosen for shame. The hem was dirty, not from sin, but from the road she was forced to walk. Someone had given her sandals, but they were too thin for the stones. She limped by the third corner. The procession was slow, winding through the village like a warning bell made flesh. People lined the sides of the narrow path. Some looked away, others leaned forward with curiosity. A few laughed under their breath. Children pointed, but the adults rarely stopped them. The older women clutched their rosaries with such force that the beads left marks in their palms. But no one stepped forward. This was how it went. A woman caught with desire, or even just accused of it, would be paraded. The priest would claim it was for her salvation. The neighbours would pretend it was tradition, and she would walk, candle in hand, until someone said it was enough. In a nearby village, another woman sat on a low wooden platform. Her crime was similar. She'd been seen speaking to a man after dusk. That alone wasn't proof, but it didn't need to be. She now wore a hood with donkey ears sewn into the sides, meant to make her look foolish. The weight of shame didn't lie in the hood itself, but in the eyes that looked at her. A boy tossed a pebble toward her feet. It rolled, then stopped. She didn't move. Her ankles were bound with a leather strap, just loose enough to let her shift when the cramps set in. Behind her, a priest sat beneath a canopy, fanning himself with a scrap of parchment. He looked bored. Public punishment had a rhythm to it. There was the march, the platform, the sermon, and finally the dispersal. For men, it often ended there. For women, it continued long after. She would return home, but home would feel different. Every eye would weigh more. Every silence would last longer. Doors wouldn't open as easily. Food wouldn't be shared as freely. People remembered things when it involved a woman, especially the things she was accused of. Inside the parish records, you would rarely find their names. They were written down as the woman from the Eastfield or the widow's daughter. Their stories faded faster than the stains on the church floor, but their reputations didn't. Some priests had their secrets, but those stayed in locked rooms. If discovered, they confessed to their superiors, received penance in private, and returned to the pulpit with their robes freshly laundered. No candle procession, no donkey hood, just silence. There was a kind of safety in being male, especially if you wore the right vestments. But for women, the line between sinner and scapegoat was thin, and often it depended on who was watching. Sometimes the punishment was less theatrical. A woman might be forced to kneel on stones during Mass. Another might be ordered to clean the chapel steps with bare hands. The physical pain was nothing compared to the smirks that followed. Public morality had a way of feeding on discomfort, and it seemed to prefer female suffering. At some point, someone made a joke that half the village's sins could be washed clean if they simply made enough women kneel in the square. It wasn't far from the truth. In a convent not far away, a sister was accused of unbecoming dreams. No details were shared, but she was removed from her post in the infirmary. She now scrubbed pots, her hands raw and red from lye. No one asked if the dreams were real. It didn't matter. Justice, for women, was less about truth and more about tone. Did she look guilty? Did she walk with shame? Did she cry in the right places? Sometimes, the only escape was distance. A few women disappeared after the punishments, sent to relatives, moved to other towns. Their stories thinned out like smoke through old chimneys. No one asked too many questions. It was easier that way. When the bells rang again for another confession, another sermon, another ritual of cleansing, the villagers showed up like always, faces calm, hands folded, and if another woman was called forward, most just watched. What followed next took those punishments and gave them sharper teeth. It wasn't just humiliation anymore. It became something darker, something with horns and accusations that came at night. They did not always scream. Some women whispered instead, caught between sleep and fever, trying to describe things they did not understand. A shape in the corner of the room, a weight on the chest at night, hands that touched without being seen. They did not say the word demon at first. That came later, when someone else put it in their mouth. The interrogation rooms were dark, not by accident, but by design. A single window, too high to see through, walls that smelled of wet stone and old salt. The table in the middle held a small iron crucifix and a cloth for wiping sweat. The questions never changed much. They only got slower, louder, closer. Some women confessed to everything, whether it was true or not. They said they flew through the night on the backs of wolves. They said they kissed the devil's feet and signed his book. One even said she bore his child. The priest wrote it all down, careful not to smudge the ink. It didn't matter if the stories made sense. The more bizarre, the better. It gave shape to the fear. It gave people something to whisper about in markets and beside wells. Of course, the truth was softer, less dramatic. Some women had vivid dreams after long fasts. Others had night terrors, waking up breathless and unsure where they were. Some simply didn't know how to explain the way their bodies reacted when no one was looking. The church called it temptation. Then it was called possession. A woman who showed too much joy or too much independence or too much confusion could easily be labelled. Her moods were studied. Her words are remembered. If she smiled at the wrong person or knew too much about herbs, suspicion followed. A rumour was enough to start the process. A cold stare during Mass. A chicken that died suddenly. A priest who hadn't forgotten a private insult. Once accused, escape was difficult. They were watched during prayer, questioned about dreams, and asked if they had touched animals in strange ways. The absurdity did not bother the interrogators. They had a script. All they needed was a name and a few nights of silence. Some women tried to reason. They quoted scripture. They begged. But reason was not part of the process. A woman who defended herself too well was considered cunning. One who wept too early was faking. One who didn't weep at all was heartless. The ideal suspect, it seemed, was one who neither resisted nor explained. It was safer, sometimes, to say yes, to agree, to admit you had danced with the devil, even if only in your dreams. The confession brought some mercy, or at least an end to the questions. The punishment might be lighter, a pilgrimage, a branding, a banishment. And what exactly did the devil look like? That was always the favourite question. The answers varied. Sometimes a black goat, sometimes a handsome man with a crooked smile. Occasionally, it was the face of someone they knew. This caused problems, especially if the face belonged to someone higher up in the church. Those details rarely made it into the official record. Not every case ended in fire. Some just faded. A few women returned to their homes, older, thinner, quieter. Their gardens are overgrown. Their doors shut more tightly. Their neighbours avoided them in public but watched them through cracks in the shutters. A priest once said that demons preferred the company of women because women were more open to touch. He didn't explain what he meant, but the men listening nodded anyway. It's always easier to agree when you're not the one being accused. The worst part was not the torture itself, but how easily people accepted the idea that a woman's desire, if unspoken or misunderstood, could be explained only by darkness, that her private fears became public sins, that her dreams, once described, became binding contracts with evil. The church found comfort in this logic. It gave them control. It made women afraid to speak, afraid to sleep, afraid to feel. Silence became survival. Obedience became armour. A quiet woman was a safe woman. A curious one was dangerous. There was one case of a woman who confessed to nothing, not even under pain. She said nothing, even when her body began to fail. The town called her a witch anyway. The church wrote her down as uncooperative. She was buried quietly, without a name. Years later, her story was still told, not as a warning, but as a curiosity, like a tale about the weather or strange stars. Looking back, it becomes clear that it was never about demons at all. It was about control, about who could speak and who had to stay silent. And the next time silence didn't work, they looked for markings, for scars, for old dreams, and then they gave those dreams a name. Some ideas were not whispered in church or courtroom. They were worn, welded, and locked in place. Some men believed their honour could be measured by how little access others had to their wives, and so they turned to metal. They crafted it in smithies, shaped it with tools usually used for horse tack or window latches. It was not designed for comfort, it was designed for control. The chastity belt became a symbol, not of faith, but of suspicion. It was made of iron, shaped like undergarments, with a thin slit at the back and a thicker clasp at the front. Some had small padlocks. Some had keys that were worn on chains around the husband's neck. The belts pinched. They left marks, but the men believed that was a small price to pay for peace of mind. They did not ask how it felt. They only asked if it worked. Of course, most women never wore one. Not because their husbands trusted them, but because the device itself was impractical. It rusted. It chafed. It turned daily life into misery, but the idea of it stayed alive, in stories, in threats, in church warnings. How fathers looked at their daughters when they reached a certain age. Control did not always come in metal. It came in layers of cloth, in the rules about how long a hem must be, how tight a bodice, what colour a woman could wear and when. Red was suspicious, black was mournful, green was youthful, blue was for the Virgin Mary, but too much blue, in the wrong cut, made people talk. Women learned to read the room before they opened their trunks. If the day called for modesty, they wore grey. If the mood shifted towards suspicion, they added a veil. Sometimes too much effort was seen as vanity. Too little was called laziness. A man might show pride in his boots. A woman might be punished for the lace on her sleeve. Words were no safer. A woman who spoke with confidence was called proud. One who spoke rarely was called secretive. If she laughed too loudly, people glanced. If she smiled at the wrong time, people whispered. Her body became something watched from all angles, not as a person, but as a problem. The sermons helped keep the pressure steady. Priests warned against temptation, not just the kind that happened between sheets, but the kind that came from glances, gestures, fabrics. Some said the fall of mankind began with a woman and a piece of fruit. That story was repeated often, not for its theology, but for its usefulness. In some villages, a woman could be fined for dressing too boldly. What that meant depended on who was looking. A low neckline, a flash of ankle, even a braid too tightly woven could spark judgment. Once, a woman was accused of witchcraft because she had a red ribbon in her shoe. The ribbon had belonged to her sister. The sister had died in childbirth. That didn't matter to the judge. There was a woman known only by her nickname, the seamstress's daughter. She worked quietly, never married, never caused trouble. But she owned a mirror, a polished, expensive one, and that was enough. People wondered who she looked at in it, or who she hoped would look back. It didn't help that her clothes fit well, that her sleeves were tailored, that her collar had no stains. All this, in a world where virtue was measured in how much dust you allowed to settle on your shoulders. So one day, when a neighbour's husband went missing for a few days, they blamed her. Nothing was proven. Nothing had to be. She was told to leave the village. No trial, just silence. The fear ran deep, not of sin, but of exposure, of being seen as a woman who might enjoy her own reflection, a woman who knew the shape of her hips. That kind of knowledge was dangerous. It could not be allowed to grow. So it was crushed early, with rules, with cloth, with looks, with cold warnings spoken softly. Iron belts were rare, but the daily rituals of control were not. They just came in quieter forms, a mother adjusting a neckline, a priest clearing his throat mid-sermon, a father scowled when his daughter danced too freely at a festival. The chastity belt, in that sense, was just the metal version of things already done by stares and silence. It's strange how many rules existed to protect men from their imagination. Instead of learning restraint, they built it onto someone else's body. Soon, though, the control would shift from what women wore to what they believed, and that brought its own kind of danger. It was not enough to say vows, not enough to sign a parchment or bow before a priest. In many corners of medieval Europe, a marriage wasn't truly a marriage until the act had been done. Not the walking down the aisle, not the ring or prayer, the other act, the one behind the curtains. Except, there were often no curtains at all. Once the ceremony ended, the crowd didn't leave. They followed, not to the bedroom, but close enough. The newlyweds were escorted like royalty, not to a throne, but to the bed. It was not a private moment. It was part of the ritual, a procession of family, friends, and in some cases, even officials. Everyone had a role. Some carried linens, others held candles, A few carried drinks to toast the union. It was meant to be festive, but for the couple, especially the bride, it often felt more like a performance than a celebration. The room would be prepared in advance. Clean sheets, fresh herbs were scattered on the floor. Sometimes rosemary or lavender if it could be afforded. On the walls, tapestries were hung not for beauty but to muffle sound. A priest might offer a final prayer, a relative might place a symbolic coin under the pillow. It all seemed quaint from a distance. But then came the expectation. In some regions, witnesses were required to stay close enough to hear. In others, they had to see, not everything, just enough. Enough to confirm that the marriage had been consummated, that the couple had fulfilled their duty. There were even towns where a trusted matron inspected the bedsheet the next morning. If it showed blood, it was proof. If it didn't, questions were asked. Some people whispered. Some took notes. For noble families, this wasn't just tradition. It was politics. A marriage might unite lands or kingdoms, which meant that proving the marriage was real became just as important as the wedding itself. An unconsummated union could be annulled. A child born from it could be questioned. So they left a little room for doubt. In some royal households, a lord or bishop would stand just outside the bedchamber door. He would listen for sounds. Sometimes servants would offer wine to loosen nerves. Sometimes they would sing to cover discomfort. But the expectation remained. The act must happen. Tonight. Publicly private. Privately public. There were stories of brides who cried through it all, of grooms who drank too much and passed out, of sheets hurriedly stained with drops of animal blood to avoid scandal. These stories didn't always make it into official records, but they lived in kitchens, market stalls, and behind chapel doors. One servant girl, whose job was to prepare the bridal chamber, once said the most exhausting part was pretending not to hear what everyone else did. She had folded sheets with trembling hands, knowing they would be inspected. Her mistress had said nothing, but her eyes were full of dread. The groom was twice her age and a stranger until that morning. Among peasants, the pressure was just as real, though perhaps less ceremonial. A neighbour might peek through shutters, a cousin might linger nearby, and if months passed with no child, the gossip would begin. Maybe he couldn't. Maybe she wouldn't. Maybe the marriage wasn't real. In a world without privacy, bodies were everyone's business. The custom of bedding witnesses varied, but the mindset behind it did not. Intimacy was never just between two people. It belonged to the community, to the family, to the church. A woman's purity was discussed like crop yields or rainfall. A man's performance was judged like harvest labour. No one admitted it out loud, but the truth was that many villagers paid more attention to the bedding than to the actual wedding sermon. And so the first night became a kind of theatre, with props, with pressure, with no intermission, a play no one asked to star in, but everyone came to watch. There's something oddly medieval about imagining love as a contract sealed in front of strangers. But perhaps it was never about love in the first place. Just lineage, legacy, land. Later, it wouldn't be the only ritual where women's bodies proved someone else's honour. Some of them would be forced to prove even stranger things. If you think marriage in medieval times meant privacy, affection, or even a sense of personal freedom, you might want to pause that thought. In some places, marriage was not only a public affair but a heavily monitored one. Love was fine in theory, but pleasure, that was something else entirely. Some sermons warned couples about loving each other too much. Too much affection was seen as weakness. Too much joy could damage the soul. One priest even wrote that a husband who laughed with his wife in bed had already begun to rot from within. You might think that was extreme, but for many churchmen, the body was a vessel to be punished, not enjoyed. The idea of mutual satisfaction in marriage made them uneasy. Clerics encouraged restraint in every form. Some advised married couples to abstain from intimacy during religious seasons. which added up to nearly half the year. Others warned that sex, even within marriage, was acceptable only for procreation. And even then, it should be done quickly, quietly, and without emotion. There were also warnings about too much eye contact, too much touching, too much smiling. Yes, smiling could be a sign that your desires had become too strong. Even during the wedding night, some priests recommended that the couple say a prayer beforehand, asking for forgiveness in case passion overtook reason. This mindset didn't stay in the sermons. It entered the bedroom. Some new brides were given strict instructions before their wedding night. Keep your eyes shut. Do not speak. Lie still. You must bear children, not to feel joy. If you made a sound, or worse, if you laughed, you could be whispered about. Some women were later accused of being too eager, too lustful, based solely on what a midwife overheard through a door. In more rigid communities, there were lectures specifically for new wives. These were not gentle or encouraging talks. They were warnings. If you enjoyed yourself, the devil might find his way in. That was not a metaphor. That was a serious belief. A woman's pleasure was seen as an open gate. And so, for many, the wedding night became not a memory of closeness, but a test of silence. This anxiety extended to the setting. Beds were covered in heavy curtains, not only to keep out the cold, but to hide expressions. A flushed cheek, a gasp, or even relaxed breathing could be noted. Privacy was limited. Some couples, especially nobles, were expected to consummate their marriage with witnesses nearby. The witnesses didn't stay for the act, but they did escort the couple to the bed, pulled the covers over them, and often stayed long enough to ensure no one tried to escape. Some church records included letters from worried husbands asking if it was a sin that their wife enjoyed their time together. The reply was usually something like, "It is better not to ask, better to pray, better to keep to yourself." One priest even advised that it was safest if the wife felt nothing at all. The less the body reacted, the less the soul was at risk. To reinforce discipline, some monks practiced their forms of restraint: wooden planks instead of mattresses, cold water poured over their heads, some tied cords around their thighs to discourage nighttime temptation. They believed that if they could deny themselves, married people should too. After all, what excuse did they have? And so, marriage became another space of monitoring. The clothes, the movements, the silences. Some women were instructed to wear dark fabrics after marriage, as bright colours were associated with pride or seduction. Others were told to cover their hair fully, even at home. And if they were caught humming, laughing, or looking too light-hearted, the scolding could come swiftly. There were always exceptions, of course. Some couples found their ways to exist within the rules. A wink at the wrong time. A hand squeeze under the table. But those were small rebellions. Private gestures in a world where even the shape of a sigh could be judged. Over time, many people learned to separate feeling from duty. They did what was expected, and a little more. The irony is, the church preached love constantly. Love of God, love of family, love of virtue, but love between spouses that had limits. Too much, and you were warned. Too little, and you were pitied. Either way, someone was always watching, even if it was just your conscience. As the candles burned low in those cold stone rooms, many newlyweds didn't feel joy. They felt pressure to perform, to behave, to pretend that everything natural had to be filtered through prayer and silence. And over time, they forgot what it felt like to simply hold someone and laugh without fear. In the end, marriage was not just about two people. It was about control, a controlled bed, a controlled home, a controlled heart. And for those who asked too many questions, there was only one answer. Lie still, say nothing, and pray. Soon, we'll step into another space where privacy is even more fragile, where pleasure had to hide beneath penance, and where a single misstep could mean public shame. Stone corridors were not always empty. Behind the quiet discipline of cloister life, Some people carried a different kind of secret, not heresy, not theft, just affection. Love that wasn't expected, love that had no safe place to speak. It might start in the refectory, with glances exchanged over bread and broth, or in the stillness of the garden, where someone lingered a moment longer by the herbs, not out of devotion, but because a familiar figure stood nearby. These small moments built something private and persistent. Among monks and nuns, same-sex love was not a legend. It was a reality hidden behind layers of rules and fear. Letters were written in small, careful script, folded, and passed quietly between hands. Words like beloved, dearest, or my light appeared in corners of prayer books or between the pages of copied psalms. These were not just literary flourishes. They were evidence of longing, written by people with no other way to say what they felt, not loud, not public, but very real. Some walked together through the cloister gardens after morning prayers, pretending their steps were just routine. Others sat side by side in silence, close enough to feel the warmth of another body through heavy wool robes. There were no vows exchanged,